simply overlooking the simple fact that if you, as a developing country, don't take measures to open up your economy and to become more competitive, your neighbors will. And we think that in the world today, there is a unique competition between the developing world to see who is going to be getting on the express train towards the future and will be the China of the next generation and who's going to be left behind. So we want to talk to you specifically about two things. We want to explain to you who the next Chinas are going to be and why specifically we think this policy is uniquely going to enable countries to actually get ahead in the next generations. And we also want to talk about why we think countries ought to be interested in the long term, the very thing that side opposition is concerned about, this 2 generations forward, and how we think ultimately we get better economies in the long run. Before that, I want to talk about a few quick things of rebuttal. So side opposition seems really concerned about how we're going to be accountable and who is going to run these organizations. But Adam and I think it's pretty clear that when, for instance, you sign a contract for a region, it's going to be pretty clear whether you're going to, who's going to be in charge of that, whether there's going to be a corporate board that's there, whether you're, no thank you, going to run that, for instance, like an overseas territory of another country. We think it's pretty clear what you're going to do. They're going to be on record about it because they're going to be there for 99 years. It's going to take a company that has some sort of long-term plan for this stuff. No thanks. We also think it's silly for them to think that a lease is unidirectional, that only a company is going to get rights under this lease, right? When you sign a contract, both parties have responsibilities, and we think that the company is going to be responsible for this thing for 99 years. They can't just walk away from it. We think that there are going to be onerous financial penalties or other penalty clauses in that contract that force them to be committed for the long term. So, no thanks. We think that in the status quo, there's not really a risk of, problems with international law. You see that there are things like offshore oil drilling rigs and things like that. There's not a whole lot of real controversy in terms of international law and how it applies. We just think they're blown it out of proportion. We also want to talk specifically about, no thanks, why would a company actually want to spend the money here to make it good and not just exploit the region? I think I've already explained to you how there are reciprocal rights and benefits and obligations under a contract. We also think that in order to maximize their investment and to please their shareholders, they're actually going to do it sustainable for 99 years. So that being said, I want to talk specifically, no thanks. No, I'll take you later in our positive matter. So we don't think this round is specifically about how you're going to have China again, because we think that China in and of itself is a somewhat unique example. China is a very large country. China is a country that had access to a lot of capital in the 1980s when they started to actually build these special economic zones, right? So we realized that in that situation, it might make sense for a special economic zone to be set up by China where the government can actually plow capital into trying to have a complementary industry against like Hong Kong or something like that. But we think that specifically, not all countries in the developing world, for instance, large parts of Africa, have access to those levels of resources. So we think that unless you're willing to actually go a little bit beyond what China did and actually give up some real right to the land and actually give up a lease voluntarily, that you're not going to have a company willing to come in and you're never going to be able to actually jumpstart and get one of these special economic zones. No thanks. No thank you. So why do we think that we ought to plan for the extreme long term? Adam and I think that this round and this model provides for a unique opportunity to do a natural experiment and to see what is the right way to develop a country. Because rarely in history, in fact never in history, has there been an opportunity to actually test multiple different styles of development. We think it's pretty easy to take a couple of uniquely, similar tracks, ones that have access to a port or, have relatively equivalent levels of resources, and you can give them out to different companies and test out several different types of development models. We think that when this happens, it allows for a country to see what might work in their region of the world with their climate and with their resources. We think that there are good motives by these corporations because obviously corporations want to make money. We think that in the long term, making money is in the interest of the countries themselves because that money can be used for all sorts of things that the country needs. I'll take you in just a minute. You can invest in education, you can invest in healthcare with the motives of reducing the infant mortality rate and increasing lifespan so that you can have better economic development. You can also, build infrastructure and allow your country to actually get a foot up in the game. Sure.
So in Lagos, Shell helped the city government revamp that city's sewage system because its employees needed flushable toilets. How likely is that under your system where all that physical presence will be sucked into a city-state on the Nigerian border?
So first of all, we think that there's an even greater incentive to develop a portion of the land that's within the country, right? Because the company has a direct stake in it, whereas in Lagos they only, have some employees living there. So we think that you're going to get better development, and plus think that you're thinking about the long term, because in 99 years this land is going to be going back to that country, and specifically this region, say it might be called Hong Kong, will become part of that country in the future. So we think that that's going to be better in the long term. But we also think that you're going to have regions next to that area that are going to grow up. You're going to have regions like Shenzhen, and you're going to have regions like Guangzhou, where people are actually going to rise up and provide supply for that region. Now, OP says simply that there's no reason why this would happen, and companies would take action to undermine the economy of the local country, but they can't actually change the rules of economics, right? There's supply and demand, and when you have one of these city-states, as it becomes more wealthy, they need people to fill in the lower levels of the economy. We think when that supply and demand exists, the country that is there outside of the borders is going to have an undeniable, economy of scale of, low-level labor that can come in and fill that, and they're also going to have a competitive advantage. So we just don't think you can poo-poo away the fact that there's going to be development spilling over the borders. So Adam and I think that in this opportunity to test something out, you have a moral obligation to actually see what would be the best. The example that we would give you is, for instance, if you wanted to do a drug trial, right? We don't think that it's reasonable to try this drug on a very small set of the population, one little subset, and say, okay, it's ready to go for the massive levels of population. We think you have an obligation to test this against different subpopulations and make sure that it actually works first. We would tell you that even if the op convinces you that in most of the situations they think that corporations are going to be inherently abusive and are going to cause problems, we think that even if, only in one case out of 10, we are going to prove to you that there's a way, that there is a better way forward for development. You have a moral obligation to actually test that out and see what is best for the developing world, both for this country specifically and its neighbors in the area. We think that a lot of people are going to benefit from this. So specifically, we also think that over the 99-year period, you're going to have a few other spillover benefits. We think that you're going to have a better system of property rights. Now, we think that this will come about for two levels. We think that, first of all, the government is going to have to actually honor the 99-year lease, and that in and of itself is a form of property right, obeying the property rights. But second of all, we think that as the city-state is reabsorbed back into the country in that 99-year period, there's going to be a system of norms and laws that are going to be absorbed back into that country, and it's going to be impossible to erode them back. We think this is proof within Hong Kong, where China has not completely stripped away the democratic progress that is made within Hong Kong. There are strong property rights, and we think that ultimately we provide a much better way to develop going forward. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank you very much for his comments, and now I'd ask TJ to continue the case for Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The extension of the closing opposition in this debate is going to bring you, we're going to focus on how this stymies the development of the developing world. We'll do that in two ways. Firstly, we'll look at how it stymies the development of the state, and it effectively creates a privatisation of government, or entrenches the trend towards a privatisation of government. And then secondly, look at how this siphons foreign direct investment away from the state and undermine the ability of the state to use the tax base that a special economic zone would actually have, as opposed to a special city-state. But before I do, let's go into some rebuttal. And I want to do a bit of a thought experiment. Let's imagine a private city. Let's call it Finkelville. Let's call it a private city where Rhodes scholarships grow on trees, everyone's the world's best speaker, and you have adoring fans following you around. In that state, the people who benefit from that state are not those who used to live in the state next to it. There are those who have been effectively flown in the kind of position of the opening government. The people who live outside that state, let's call them people who live in Jeffreyville, and the capital is Cal, right? If you live in those sorts of places, we don't think you get the benefit. We think all you get is kind of the Qatar economic development, those who fly in and fly out. We don't see the development in the long term that either the opening or closing want to do. Very quick in rebuttal. First, in economic development. The argument from that side is you will get significant economic development and people will benefit. This is not a choice between no economic development and a city-state, right? There are lots of ways a state can try and get foreign direct investment, and special economic zones are a good way in some circumstances. But when you have a private city that sits outside the purview of the state, we think you get an underdevelopment of those who live around it, because there are lots of big high walls in between you and them, and the ability for someone to actually get in there is undermined. On foreign direct investment, I will deal with that in my own extension. On shareholders, what we heard was a sort of ridiculous argument at closing that, well, you'll have, corporations and boards will decide the way in which these states are governed. Firstly, shareholders have a different incentive than citizens, right? Because citizens often want certain things given to them that don't necessarily profit the state, right? Shareholders only want profit. But furthermore, the argument was, well, if they treat it really bad, I'm sure the contract that the state sold them under will kind of limit their ability to do certain things. My extension will deal with that, but often when you're in this position, you don't have great bargaining power. When you privatise the state's ability to actually enforce its own will, you aren't very good at sticking up to foreign groups. Second point, on social development, very quickly, the argument that it will influence the state, that is predicated on the individual actually having some access to the state and using the resources of the state, having a stake in the state, right? If you don't live in the state, if you don't have any stake in that state, you don't necessarily need that kind of economic development or liberal democratic development the opening government wanted to point out. I think overpopulation, we pointed out pretty clearly, is ridiculous, right? Because these people aren't going to be rich enough to move in, all they'll be is itinerant workers who go in and go out. Thirdly and finally, on the extension, what we heard was there'd be sustainable economic development. We have a few responses to that. Firstly, we think you're more likely to cut and run when you lose your investment after 99 years, right? Like, it's compulsorily acquired back from you. What is the interest in developing something in a very long-term sense, as opposed to, and this is the problem, right? Because the opening government wanted to be smart and say it's about leasing and not selling. Like, that's okay, right? But it's still a stupid way because you lose your outcome. Secondly, it doesn't deal with development inside and outside that state, right? It's not that choice. You can have development in these countries without having the position of the opening government. And finally on this point, right, there is, and I'll take closing in a second, like, there are lots of resources you can exploit for a long period of time. Calm down, it's alright. You'll be fine. There's lots of things you can exploit for 99 years of time and get out there without doing sustainably. Yeah.
So, never do we say that a country is required to use our system. We think that there are a level of countries that aren't competitive like China, like countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where the only way you can get investment is to actually give up title to the land.
Like, that's fine, right? But this kind of like thought experiment we want to run an extension about the moral choice, and as long as it works in 1 out of 10, that's fine, right? We think we know what works for development, right? We think there are lots of experiments going on in the world. We think Africa and in Southeast Asia, and we pointed out in my extension how you get the best development. So let's move on to my extension. So firstly, in this sort of part, how do you privatise the issue of the state? We think this model entrenches a growing trend that occurs in the first and third world, the privatisation of states. We're pretty okay with it in the first world, no thank you, for a number of reasons. Because there are significant institutions, the ability of governments to hold accountable private institutions that run, say, water or run security. In the third world, that does not exist. You do not have the institutions that are able to actually hold these institutions accountable. So what happens is you privatise security, you privatise water, privatise lots of things. Creation of the city-state outside the purview of government insists that you are not strong enough to actually develop that country in your own right. Why is that bad? 3 reasons. Firstly, it's fundamentally unaccountable, right? You have a group of people who live on your soil that cannot hold your government accountable and are not held to the purview of that government. That's particularly important in African states, where these countries have escaped all forms of accountability because they effectively outsource all of their government actions to private corporations. It lacks the development of institutions in that government. And thirdly and finally, it removes the ability of those institutions and states to stand up to private corporations. No thank you. Because it says you are reliant on them to run parts of your country that you cannot run yourself. Moving on to my second point of extension about foreign direct investment, no thank you, and development. On foreign direct investment, the first part of this argument, it siphons off FDI to the city-state because it looks like that country is inept. It also says that people need to get into that city-state to develop as opposed to other places. You cannot demonstrate a steady tax base that you actually need. This is important for this argument, right? You need to show that you have education and healthcare and a steady stream of tax to show that you can provide for those on the ground to actually get foreign direct investment into your country. When you sell off a large portion of your land and say you can no longer do those things, you remove the ability and the incentive for those countries to come in. That is a problem. Furthermore, there's been an assumption on the government side in this debate that you're only going to sell like desert land. Like, what's to stop them from selling a rainforest? What's to stop them from selling other parts of the land that could be used for development in the long term? There's been an assumption that there's all this unoccupied land that nobody is using. Finally, we think it's bad to have these effective governments that aren't very strong and don't have strong institutions and are oftentimes very corrupt, having a huge influx of cash when you lease out this land, right? We would prefer a steady stream of income coming from an area than a large amount of money into these countries. We think it's harder to expropriate this kind of amount of money when it's a steady stream as opposed to a large amount. The end of our side, Mr. Speaker, what we've shown you is we need to move forward with foreign direct investment. This undermines that. We proudly beg to oppose.
Thank the Speaker very much for his comments. And then we move to the whip speeches. If I could ask Adam Goldstein, for all your flight needs, go to www.pickbunk.com to close out the case for
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Speaker speaks the truth. Let's talk about the assumptions that underlie the opposition case, because there are a bunch of them that they rely on consistently all up and down the bench. The first is that it's bad if only Westerners move into this administrative region. Now, firstly, I don't think that they ever proved that only Westerners would move in. I think that our first half did an excellent job of explaining how, even if initially it's Westerners in that area, there are inevitably going to be needs that make it more competitively advantageous for those in the surrounding regions to commute or to move into the city. But even if it's the case that only Westerners move in, we also think that our opening half explained how those people will bring ideas and ways of doing business that will help not only spread throughout the rest of the country, but also revert back to the host country after the end of the 99-year lease. Secondly, the assumption on the opposition has been that you can just have other business-friendly policies and that will be sufficient to get foreign direct investment. Firstly, we think this largely concedes the argument that the world is headed towards a situation in which countries compete on business friendliness. And what we've asserted on our side of the House is that if countries don't go along these lines, that they will lose their most skilled citizens, and they'll lose out on economic opportunities to other neighboring countries that do have more business-friendly rules. Look, for example, at how the rise of Dubai and the United Arab Emirates sucked in workers from other parts of the Middle East. We think that this is what you risk if your country isn't willing to get out in front of the trend and ensure that any companies that move in will have absolute certainty that property rights are going to be protected in a certain area for 99 years long. This is why China is not a good example for them. China had the ability to have a large amount of upfront infrastructure investment so that they could amortize, so that they could pay for the costs that otherwise the companies would have had to pay for themselves. Effectively, China subsidized the development of those special economic regions. If you are a developing country in Africa and you don't have the capital to subsidize the entry of new companies, then you need to find another way to attract those companies to your country. We think we provide that with the ironclad guarantee that this land will be yours for 99 years. No, thank you. Now let's talk about the question of accountability, because I think this has been batted back and forth throughout the round.
Point, sir.
First, sure, I'll take closing.
Okay, you say countries ought to compete. Fine. That's not what you're proposing. It is explicitly countries not competing. They're selling land to somebody else, thereby implying that everybody else still left in, Nigeria can't compete and ought not be invested in.
Right, so, we think that there are certain practicalities on the ground that wouldn't allow a country to completely make itself business friendly. For example, perhaps the country itself has partially been captured by the biggest corporate benefactor within that nation. We think a country can recognize that it won't ever have the full credibility to implement business-friendly policies on a predictable basis within all of its borders, but that it could be perfectly plausible and perfectly credible for it to do it in a small region. That credibility, that certainty, is what brings companies into a certain region. No, thank you. Now, the question of accountability. I think that side opposition has wasted most of their time talking about how there won't be a clear line of accountability. In a lease, it explains who's responsible for what. We think that companies will do that here. We also think that opposition has just asserted that it's going to be the worst companies in the world that move into these regions. That's nonsense. There are lots of other people who don't necessarily have a pure profit motive who might want to move into these regions. Perhaps non-profit organizations, or just companies whose bylaws specify that they can't do certain horrific things. Like Netflix, for example, is really well known for a really generous sort of corporate welfare policy. We think furthermore, you can have individuals who simply want to perform experiments within these countries. Think of Peter Thiel, who wants to set up something offshore. Maybe he would exit one of these countries instead. No, thank you. Okay, so all of that aside, why do we think that even if you don't think any one of those examples is particularly compelling, you have an obligation at least to try? This is the most crucial assertion that is false of the closing opposition. That is that we know what makes development work. Quite simply, we don't know what makes development work. We don't know whether Hong Kong was successful because it's a port city and port cities have certain network effects. We don't know if Hong Kong was successful because of its geographic location, or the fact that it had a large number of people who were able to fill jobs quickly, or because of the special economic zone that the Chinese government set up. The reason we don't know which of these causes is true is because they all coincided in time. The fact of the matter is that even scholars today disagree about exactly what it is that allows development to take place, what the critical ingredients are, and in what order those ingredients need to be added to the mix. We think that just as drug companies have a moral obligation to test out their hypotheses, to not allow themselves to simply be guided by their assumptions, their drawn conclusions of the recent past, we think that it's essential that countries experiment and continuously test their hypotheses in a separate, controlled experiment. It isn't sufficient just to have your entire country become more quote-unquote business-friendly. You need to run that experiment simultaneously with a different set of rules and see which one comes out better. If you don't do that, you run the risk that you will have a country that believes in an old model of development, a country that's wedded to the past and unwilling to view that there might be some hidden factor that actually drives the development of countries. I'll take over.
So are you seriously suggesting that Western companies should conduct experiments on the people of the developing nations?
No.
When, as your member said, these could fail 90% of the time.
No, what I'm suggesting is that countries should conduct experiments by allowing different companies to come into different parts of their country and test different models of development, whether resource dependent, personnel dependent, geography dependent, or whatever else it is. And the fact of the matter is that the answer to that question might differ from country to country. It might be that in a landlocked country, the best method of development is to have a most central location so that you can aggregate resources from all around the country, whereas in a port city, it might make sense to have the development city be right on the water so that you can interact with international trade. You don't know the answer to this until you ask the question, and you don't know how to answer that question until you try it. We don't think it's likely that these abuses that they talk about will be so horrific that individuals would choose to go there and then not choose to leave if these harms came true. We think at the point at which individuals would be using their own autonomy and their own choice as to whether to move into these countries, whether to move into these cities, they are speaking to the experiment. They are explaining to you through the data which of these models is preferable to your citizenry. We think that's a question you must ask. We think that that's the best way to develop. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, very much. Now I call on the final speaker, Ms. Bronwyn Kell, to close out the case for Australia and the debate as a whole.
Mr. Speaker, I'm no expert in development studies, but let me just suggest this, that a state that is looking to develop, when it allows for, indeed helps to create a probably more liberal, better run, richer city-state on its borders to actively compete with it for foreign direct investment is making a pretty stupid development decision. We don't think that is part of the mystery of development, closing government. We think that is pretty clearly dumb. So, I'll first be talking about accountability. I'll secondly be talking about foreign direct investment and development more generally, specifically into the long term. I'm going to then be talking about whether the presence of this city-state will have some kind of politically or economically liberalising effect on the state that is left behind. So first of all, on accountability. Absolutely, contracts are enforceable, the terms therein are enforceable. Unfortunately, this is a very special kind of contract. It's a contract that confers sovereignty. That clause makes it spectacularly difficult to then enforce all of the other clauses because they rely on shared jurisdiction. They rely on there being some kind of supervening authority, like, I don't know, a Supreme Court that you both share, to enforce that particular contract. So even if you write them well, which we think may well not happen because of the power imbalance of the players involved, we think that you're not going to be able to enforce them. We think that that pretty resoundingly removes the notion that we're going to have perfect accountability. Secondly, onto this question of foreign direct investment and development more generally. We think that the closing government was unresponsive to what Tim brought you. I'm going to reiterate why it is that these city-states will suck development that would have otherwise gone to the developing world. No thank you. Because it's not like the developing world is not getting foreign direct investment now. We think Southeast Asia and Africa are increasingly getting the attention of investors from the West and indeed are investing in themselves in intelligent ways more and more often. Why is this less likely? Well, first of all, when you need, say, a regional hub in Southeast Asia, you're not going to invest in Jakarta anymore. What you're going to do is go to the private island near Bali that Shell has conveniently bought, set up lower corporate taxes in, and has nice apartments for your employees. So we think you are less likely to physically and economically locate yourselves in the surrounding country or region. Secondly, because it looks like a tacit admission of total ineptitude on the part of that state because they had to totally outsource, not just like services, but sovereignty, right? We think that is harmful in terms of the confidence of investors, and confidence is key when investing in the developing world. Thirdly, we think that foreign direct investors look to a state with a healthy tax base, a demonstration that they can generate revenue internally by investing in themselves, that they can perhaps pay for primary and secondary education into the future to give you the human resources that you may need as an investor in that state. We think that this debate, Tim told you this, is not a choice between no development and like a country run by Shell. We think it is oftentimes a choice between long-term development by the state in that area, particularly since it's likely to be like a port region or a rainforest or somewhere near a train line, right? And so since they give up the possibility of that tax being paid back to them into the future, they lose that attractive element of their state for foreign direct investors and the tax base as well. So we think that is three ways in which this harms the people left behind in that state, Mr. Speaker. Then we had this truly bizarre part of the extension from the closing government. They said, development, what a mystery. Hong Kong, maybe it was because it was a port city. Maybe it was because it had lots of itinerant workers from China. Maybe it was because it was run by relatively liberal Britain for a while and managed to get up trade traditions that helped development. Okay, thank you for enumerating them. We think states should do those, right? We think that on the margins, development is a mystery. At its core, it probably isn't. You need capital to be attracted to your state. You need a steady stream of tax revenue. No thank you. You need foreign direct investors to not look at you as a basket case. No thank you. Take a seat. We think that that is all... Didn't actually mean to say that. We think that that is, no thank you, all undermined. And I said this in my introduction, but when you're all about competitive advantage, when you're all about competition, about demonstrating that you're the guy in Central America that people should be investing in, that you're the state in Southeast Asia that people should be investing in, creating a state on your border that will probably be better at a bunch of stuff is really, really silly. We don't think that just having itinerant workers go in there and then come home at the end of the day is enough. Qatar has sucked investment and revenue and infrastructure and just buildings, right, from the surrounding areas. And that's fine for Qatar, but we think that had those states around them sold Qatar 50 years ago, they probably would be kicking themselves, right, because they have sucked development from the surrounding areas. No thank you. No thank you. So, secondly, development and liberalisation. No thank you. They said that the presence of employees of foreign kind of companies, that the mere presence of the companies themselves is enough to spur governments towards providing better services and perhaps providing kind of a type of political liberalism that states don't have right now. No thank you. Okay, Tim told you this and didn't get a response. We think that when you have no demonstrable interest in the sewerage system of Lagos, as they have created, we don't think you agitate for that to improve. We think that these employees don't have the incentive that they have now to agitate for the government to provide better services for themselves. Sure, they're being self-interested, but happily, that often overlaps with the interests of the local population opening.
Right. There are cases that companies are going to invest in railroads and next to ports, places that are going to allow them to circumvent the host country. How are these uninhabitable regions, which we're proposing specifically, they're going to be selling?
Okay, Firstly, we don't think they'll just be uninhabitable regions. We think Shell will say, hey, you guys have some pretty sweet port land we think we could develop. I know we're technically only supposed to take desert, but how about we give you $100 million and take that land? We think states will take them up on that offer. Secondly, all those railroads, all that infrastructure will stop at the border. There's no benefits for citizens there. And why don't they just do it themselves? Sure, it might take longer. Sure, the injection of cash might be smaller in the short term, but for countries that continually expropriate government funds, it's probably good they don't have a huge injection of cash, right? Tim also told you that, and that got no response. So we think on every level, that point of information fails. So, we think that these employees in these companies, when you don't exist in a state, don't have any responsibility to agitate for the improvement of services in that state. We told you that that happened in Lagos, where Shell actually constructed a sewage system for Lagos. That wouldn't happen if the Shell employees lived in a city-state on the border, right? Also, liberalisation and the influence of the outside world is tricky at best. When people who seek for that political liberalisation, the economic liberalisation, don't actually live in your state, to what extent will they truly agitate for liberalisation of any kind? There will literally be a probably highly fortified border in between the Dutch people who now work for KLM in this particular country and the people who are still living in squalor without investment in the home state. So, ladies and gentlemen, this development may well be a mystery on the margins, but I'm pretty happy to say that this is a on its face, silly development decision by the developing world. It doesn't increase political accountability, it reduces it. We're pleased to oppose.